What's up guys, welcome back to another GGF video review, and today we are finally taking a look at the LIAN EVO XL. Now you guys have been waiting for this for a very long time. I've been having messages, comments, emails, everything you name it on when this case is coming out. Now I do apologize, this was delayed a little bit and it was probably because of me, because I did notice there was an issue with installing and removing GPUs. Now I did leave that part I covered in this video because I wanted you to see what the issue was and how LIAN tackled on fixing it. So basically the issue was with their new Tooless PCI installation system. Once you install the GPU in, it literally got jammed in and you could not get it out. So LIAN went to work on fixing that. They've made all new motherboard trays. They've sent them all out to all the reviewers. So by doing that, they had to delay the launch about 3 weeks. So it was originally going to be about early August, and now it's been delayed till September the 7th, which hopefully is today. And that's when the case is going to launch for the pre-orders. I'll put them all up in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much why it was delayed. I do apologize for that, but it's good to see that LIAN didn't just sort of kind of just let it go by, because some GPUs worked, some didn't. Some people's cases did. The white case was a little bit worse than the black case. LIAN could have just let it go by, but they actually said, no, we're going to fix this. We're going to delay it a little bit longer and make sure it's perfect. Now this video is going to be quite long because I cover everything you need to know about this case, especially on the custom water cooling side of things, like not just 360 rad support, but also 420 rad support, because this is what this case is all about. So you might want to grab something to eat, grab some snacks, grab something to drink, and let's jump in and learn all about the EVO XL. Starting with exterior differences, we can see straight away the XL is a bit higher, coming at 532mm from 460mm on the EVO. The width has also increased to 305mm, up from 289mm on the EVO. Chassis bottom clearance has also had a nice lift, going from 25mm on the EVO to 32mm on the XL. This is always welcomed for the extra bottom intake cooling. Case depth is now 523mm, up from 463 on the EVO, not including protruding thumb screws. Case materials are roughly the same, with the internal chassis being made from steel, some plastic parts for the feet, I/O module and removable fan filter, while the top panel, rear panel and the two side panels at the top and the front are all aluminum. I always feel the black model on the EVOs feel more premium than the white, as where the aluminum parts on the black are brushed and on the white they are just painted white. I would say the main external differences, apart from overall size, all come from the rear. On the left side, we can see hard drive cages have been bumped up to 2, and these are no longer accessible from the outside. I'll talk about these later in the review when I cover storage. PSU location is now fixed in the center, and I'll also cover clearances and fitment on this later. One very nice feature I can see is the XL follows a similar design element to the O11 Mini, where the motherboard can be adjusted up and down. On the EVO, it was fixed. As you can see, there is a cover plate at the very top and the very bottom, thus giving us 3 layout positions, an upper, middle and lower. We also get another bonus. As for this to happen, the motherboard tray is now completely removable, making installing components that little bit easier. I'll touch base more on this when I cover chassis internals. Another interesting and I would say very bold move is that all the PCI sock covers are screwless and held into place via a magnetic lock mechanism. This can be good and bad. Yes, no screws are required, making it screwless, but if over time a part fails, it will be impossible to keep your PCIe devices screwed in. For my testing, I found I had some issues, as each slot has what I would call a little knob sticking out, which lines up with the holes on your PCIe devices. The magnetic lock system is very strong, and I'll cover all this later on. Side panels are removed and attached the same way as on the EVO. They simply push on and off and can be secured via a small screw at the top for say transportation. I did find the XL to be much harder to push on and off due to one extra pushing clip in the center. For those interested to know just how much louder closing the side panel is, well, listen for yourself. Side panels come in at 4mm thick, and on the white I would say are 100% clear, and on the black model they have the standard LIAN O11 dark tint. A major step forward in this chassis design is that the corner pillar can now be removed. LIAN ships it installed for structural support for transportation, but the user can either leave it in or remove it. For me, I would build the system with the pillar installed, then remove it at the very end. Removing it is simple. 4 screws, 2 at the top and 2 at the bottom. Now with both the front and side glass panels off, there is quite a bit of flex. Unless you run your cases with no side panels, then this could be an issue for you. But once installing the side panels back on, even just the front, there's plenty enough to make up for that pillar being removed. Now you can see there's just no flex at all. Chamfer corners have also been added to the tempered glass side panels, and this makes for a nice smooth transition in that main corner where the pillar has been removed. But I just can't get over how distracting that live edge of the glass is. I haven't noticed it before on cases, but only ones with chamfered corners. I found this the same with the NV7. At first I thought, okay, maybe it's worth with the pillar installed, as being white right behind it, it was overexposing it. But once I removed the pillar, you can still clearly see it. I guess we can't judge on this too much until we have a full build inside with lighting. Just to note that on the black model, this isn't an issue. The rear side panel is aluminum and simply pushes off. LIAN have added side pins now to help secure this panel, as these are not found on the EVO. A nice touch now that at the rear, a small groove can be found at the top and the bottom to help remove this panel. The power, reset and RGB controls are kept the same as previous, and the power button still shows the power LED. The front I/O module can still be moved around to 3 different locations, just like on the EVO, which include the default front location, side, and at the rear. This I/O module has now been beefed up with 4 USB 3.0 Type A from the 2 found on the EVO, USB-C 3.1 and an audio combo port. An RGB strip can also be found along the front right side of the XL. This can be controlled via the front panel buttons or offloaded to your motherboard's RGB header. Only one dust filter is pre-installed on the XL, which slides out at the bottom, but LIAN also include 3 more magnetic dust filters in a separate box, 1 for the top and 2 for the rear side panel. Moving inside the XL, and now I'm going to drop off the original EVO comparison and just focus on the XL features. There is too many internal design changes to keep going back and forth, and just about everything internally has been redesigned from the ground up. We now find 420 radiator support in all 3 radiator locations, adjustable and removable motherboard tray, as well as a completely redesigned upright GPU bracket. Motherboard support, you'll easily fit eATX, and you would hope so, being the XL. My test motherboard is the ROG X670E Extreme, which is 278mm wide, which basically goes right to the edge of the motherboard tray. 24-pin cable clearance was no issue at all, as cable grommets are found on the side of the motherboard tray and not on the face of this tray, so no matter how wide your motherboard is, you'll never block these holes. Even something like the W790 Sage fits and clears for 24-pin installation. Impractical for a case like this, yes, but it still works. There's even enough room behind to side mount a radiator and fans, roughly 100mm. For even better support in this area, the side radiator bracket can even be rotated to push the radiator and fans towards the front of the case, leaving you more room along the motherboard side, going from 18mm to 38mm with my test Overclockers UT60 420 radiator installed. Plenty of cable grommets can be found along the motherboard tray, with some of the largest grommets I've seen. 2 huge ones can be found at the top for EPS, fans and whatnot. These are designed in a way that when the motherboard tray is either lifted or dropped, these grommets will always be accessible. We find 4 grommets at the very bottom for motherboard connections and bottom case fans. Once again, no issues here if the motherboard tray is lifted or lowered. 3 grommets can be found along the right side of the motherboard, 2 long ones that basically cover the full length of the motherboard, while a smaller grommet can be found right at the top for additional cable routing. Moving on to the removable motherboard tray, and this is super simple to remove. Just 4 thumb screws hold the tray in place, 2 at the rear and 2 on the front of the tray. Now, can we just stop here to appreciate how every thumb screw comes pre-installed with the soft washer dampener. This isn't the first time LIAN have done this, but I don't think I've ever mentioned it before. Once the 4 thumb screws are removed, push the tray towards the front of the chassis. The motherboard tray comes pre-installed in its default position, roughly centered in the case. There's 82mm of clearance above the motherboard and 89mm of clearance below. As I said earlier, the motherboard tray has 3 positions. Above and below the tray each have a 35mm spacer. Removing the top spacer and reinstalling at the bottom now gives us 47mm of clearance above the motherboard and 124mm below. To put this into context, here's an Overclockers monster 80mm thick radiator with LIAN 28mm thick P28 fans. Now going the other way and adding both spacers at the top instead of the bottom, and if you've been listening, you should already know how much top clearance we have now, which is 117mm, and now the bottom gives us 54mm. Now with that same radiator config up the top, just shows how much space there really is. Heck, even adding the same radiator config again at the bottom shows some serious radiator support, which we'll cover more in detail later. GPU clearances, you'll have absolutely no issues here with 490mm to the very front of the case or 300mm to the start of the side radiator location. For long GPUs protruding into the side radiator location with the side radiator bracket in its back position, there is 125mm of clearance for radiator and fans. Bear in mind, in the back position, this bracket is flush against the back side panel, so no fans can go behind this bracket. With this bracket flipped around, there is 88mm now for clearance between the GPU, as well as 41mm of clearance in the back chamber. LIAN now includes an updated anti-sag bracket with a new design. This works similar to the older GB001, but now has a toolless adjuster. Install the two supplied standoffs as shown, then mount the bracket on top. You can see with the Strix 48 installed, sag isn't too bad, but it could do with some anti-sag treatment. The top side of the bracket has what I would call a buffer, so you don't overcorrect your sag, but this can be removed if you wish. Then on the bottom, just slide the support up until it clicks. As you can see, there is no sag now, and overall GPU bracket also works with the ATX boards, and the supplied extender is used to install behind the motherboard. For Waterblocked GPUs, there's roughly 170mm of width for clearance. This may seem like a lot, but with this 4090 Strix with an Overclocked block, there's not much room left to the side panel. I tried what I would say is my largest GPU, and that's the 4090 HOF with the bits power block, and this one still managed to fit, so I think most users should be okay. You'll also find the anti-sag bracket doesn't support shorter blocked GPUs like this Strix 4090 with an Overclocked block. Moving on to the toolless installation of PCI devices, and this gave me a bit of grief. Installing cards I had no problems at all, but removing them is where I had issues. I feel the small knobs that stick out that align the GPU I/O bracket are just too big, and over time you can see the powder coating is coming off. Once the card was in, it was in real tight and I could not pull the card out. The only way to remove my GPU comfortably without ripping the cooler off was to tap the I/O bracket from the back with a screwdriver and hammer. I tried multiple blocked and air-cooled GPUs. Over time they did seem to be easier to remove, but the air-cooled white Strix would not budge every time. I even tried the black XL and I still have the same issue. I'll feed this back to LIAN and I'll cover this in the outro. Around the back of the XL we see a similar O11 style layout. The usual cable management door can still be found, but this time held in place via magnets. This door can also hold 3 2.5-inch SSDs, or if you like, this door can be completely removed as well. A nice touch is the little magnet that keeps the door open while you work on your system. PSU support can be found locked in the middle, and up to the default cable routing is 192mm. Now to me, that's not much, and as you can see with this Thor P2 1000W, it just fits, but thankfully all cable management brackets are toolless and can be removed to just about anywhere you like. LIAN have even included an extra bracket as well. For larger units like this monster 1600W Seasonic, I found the brackets had to go above and below the PSU, not in between. The brackets can also go vertically as well. One thing I dislike is that there is no direct access behind the motherboard like other cases have. Moving on to storage, and you'll find two hard drive cages, one at the top and one at the bottom. These are locked in via magnets and swing out for installing and removing drives. Each cage can take two 3.5-inch hard drives or two 2.5-inch SSDs. These cages are fully hot swap, so all cables are included. Just slide the drive in and you're good to go. Each cage uses one SATA for power and two SATA data cables. Each cage can also accommodate a 120mm slim fan if you require extra drive cooling. Mounting screws are also supplied for these fans. If you're not using hard drives at all, these drive cages can be removed altogether to free up some space. There's also three 2.5-inch SSD locations on the cable management door, which I mentioned earlier. Now onto radiator support, but first I'd like to give a huge shout out to Overclockers and ModMyMods for supporting all the gear for this review. I'll be covering all radiator locations in both 120 and 140mm standards, as this is what the XL is all about. Full 420 radiator support in all locations. This time around I've gone with all Overclockers white radiators, as I find they match best with the LIAN white chassis. There's a good chance that the desired radiator you wish to use will differ to what I'm using. I'll list all the Overcool item numbers when I use a particular radiator in a shot. All because my radiator fits in a particular location does not mean another brand's radiator will. I try my hardest to give you the best coverage on radiator support in my case reviews and cannot test every brand. So the best way is to compare the radiator I use to the one you wish to use to see if it's bigger or smaller in width, length, and depth. This part is going to be exceptionally long, as now covering 2 sets of radiator sizes in each location is a lot of work. I've also decided not to test each radiator in each of the 3 motherboard positions, center, upper, or lower. The main radiator locations, top and bottom, each sport a removable bracket, undo the 2 locking screws, slide to the right, and out it comes. I've also decided that when I use a 120mm standard radiator, like a 360, I'll use black fans, and when I use a 140mm standard, like a 420, I'll use white fans. The top radiator location has 95mm of clearance for radiator and fans to the dim slots on my Z790 Apex, or to play it safe, 82mm to the top of the motherboard. With a ridiculous 80mm thick 360 monster radiator installed, you find that although it does clear the motherboard VRM heatsink, it does fail on the memory. With a more modest UT60 60mm thick 360 radiator and fans, we easily clear the memory this time. And yes, that is the brand new G.Skill Trident Z White Edition DDR5. Don't forget that the motherboard tray can be lowered 35mm, so if for some reason you have a couple of 360 monster radiators lying around, it would fit in its lowest position. Moving to the bottom radiator location, and with the motherboard tray in its stock position once again, we find 89mm of clearance for radiator and fans to the bottom of the motherboard. With that monster radiator not giving up, I was able to install that with fans, no trouble at all. 120mm radiator standards can run up past the motherboard, there's just enough clearance for motherboard headers to clear. So things are looking pretty good. We have a 60mm thick 360 at the top, 80mm thick 360 at the bottom. Let's throw in a GPU to see how things look. Not bad at all. Moving to the side, and once again we find LIAN multifunctional bracket. This is toolless, removable, and can be installed 4 ways. The first 2 options move the radiator closer or further away from the motherboard, 48mm away from the side in its furthest spot and 28mm in its closest position. The other 2 options control the depth, to have the bracket pushed all the way back or more towards the center of the chassis, with the top and bottom radiators back in the case and the side bracket all the way to the back. There is a whopping 137mm from the bracket to the Monster 360 radiator at the bottom. As both bottom and top radiator brackets are centered in the same position within the case, side clearance from the bracket to the top or bottom radiator is the same each time. Now we can fit yet another 360 80mm thick monster with fans on the side, just insane. I even had 52mm of clearance for fittings. With the side radiator bracket flipped to its middle position, we now have 100mm of clearance for radiator and fans in the main section and 41mm in the rear chamber. Here I've gone with the 360 XT45 45mm thick with fans in the main section and also fans in the rear chamber for a push-pull config. If going with fans on the side or a 360 radiator, LIAN provides 2 blanking plates to help with internal fan pressure. Now let's take a look at all this again, but with 420 radiator support. Starting at the bottom this time, and once again with the motherboard tray in its center position, I was able to fit a UT60 420 60mm thick radiator with fans. Bottom motherboard I/O was close, but still cleared fine on my test Z790 Apex motherboard. Even on a ROG 790 Extreme, it was fine as well. You have to remember, this is a big radiator. For the bottom here, I can't see anyone needing any more room for this, even with vertical GPU risers, should not be an issue. Unfortunately, I do not have the new vertical riser kit for the EVO XL, so I could only test with the vertical riser kit from the original EVO. The only issue here is that the screw holes in the EVO vertical bracket are too small to fit over those small knobs, so I drilled the holes out larger on the bracket and I was good to go. The UT60 420 60mm radiator with fans has no issues clearing the vertical GPU bracket. Currently the bracket is installed starting in the second PCI slot and there's 10mm between the bracket and fans. Installing the vertical GPU bracket in the first slot would give us even more room. At the top, and yes, once again with the motherboard tray in its default center position, I was able to fit the same UT60 420 60mm thick radiator with fans, but things were getting tight. With my Z790 Apex, I was still able to clear EPS cables and VRM heatsinks just, but with something like the ROG Z790 Extreme with VRM heatsink slightly higher, there was no way to install the same radiator and fan combo. Dropping down to an XT45 420 45mm thick radiator with fans is a much better choice, but the issue I had is Overclockers only make white 420 radiators that are 60mm thick, so for a complete white build I was going to need to make 60mm thick 420s fit in the top, bottom and side. But just drop the motherboard tray down. Great question, and I'm glad you asked. Doing this does in fact allow the UT60 420 60mm thick radiator to now fit at the top with fans, but as we've lowered the bottom, we now cannot fit the same rad combo as we did before. You can clearly see it fouling on the motherboard and bottom connectors. Even dropping down to an XT45 420 45mm thick radiator with fans still fouled on the motherboard. Personally, if I were you and to play it safe, I would go with something like an XT45 420 45mm thick radiator at the top with a thicker UT60 420 60mm at the bottom. Moving on to the side radiator location, and the only issue I had was installing the Overclockers radiators when the bracket was in its back position. The radiator fits fine into the bracket, but it does not fit fine once installing top fittings in the end and one in the drain port. With the stop fittings adding to the overall length, this now causes the radiator to foul on the chassis frame. The total length for radiator in the side location with the bracket in its back position from chassis frame from top to bottom is 464mm, and the stock UT60 420 radiator is 463mm without stop plugs. The actual spec Overclockers states is 468mm, and I've got to give credit where credit is due, as they add the extra stop fittings in the calculated length, even though they don't come pre-installed. With that out of the way, the easiest solution is to install fans at the back first, then the radiator. Then I was able to install another set of fans on the front of the radiator in the main section for a push-pull setup. Then to take it to the next level, I was even able to install the UT60 420 60mm thick radiator at the top and another UT60 420 60mm thick radiator at the bottom. Things were tight, and even though I could install fittings on the side radiator, some fancy tubing runs will be needed and most likely soft tubing. But this is what I would call the most extreme case scenario. Personally, for a 420 radiator setup, I would go a 45mm thick at the top, 45mm thick on the side, and with a 60mm thick at the bottom. The real killer for me was not being able to get the 420s to sit flat against the bracket when the side bracket was in its back position. The last two areas I want to cover are inverting the XL and the upright GPU bracket. I left these to last as I feel these will be least used by most users. These features are carried over from the original EVO, but the upright GPU bracket and fitment has been completely redesigned. Inverting the XL is done in a few simple steps. Unscrew and remove the top cover, then remove the top and bottom radiator brackets. Unlock the I/O module and feed all the cables out to completely remove it. At the rear of the chassis, locate the locking latch and lift up. While lifting up, push the frame forward to release it, then lift the case off the base. Flip the base over and now install it on top, locking into place. Feed the front I/O module cables through and lock into desired position. Flip the case over onto its feet, reinstall radiator brackets and top panel cover. One last part is to unscrew and flip the PSU support bracket around. I'm not going to cover all radiator support again for the inverted layout. Technically everything stays the same, it's just that now the top clearance was what the bottom clearance was, and the bottom clearance now is what the top clearance was in the standard layout. Moving on to the upright GPU bracket, and this is an optional extra, and this works with the other optional extra, the 900mm Gen 4 PCIe riser cable. Both these kits come in black and white to match the case you have. The main difference this time is that the upright bracket is now installed onto the side radiator bracket. This makes it way more versatile than before. You can mount the bracket on your GPU outside the case. There's even a small slit for the riser cable to feed through. This bracket even supports beefy 4-slot GPUs. Once assembled with your GPU, feed the riser cable through the cutout in the case and slot the unit into place. It's amazing how we went from this on the original EVO to this. Also, being mounted to the radiator bracket, we can now flip the whole GPU with ease, whether you want your ports at the top or at the bottom. Installing display cables was a nightmare on the original EVO, but now this has been fixed. Cables can be installed outside, then routed around the back. And yes, fans can still be installed on the back of the radiator bracket. For Waterblocked GPUs, the only issue I was unable to pre-install the GPU before on the bracket, then drop it in. The terminal was just getting in the way. To get around this, I mounted the GPU to the upright bracket first, then mounted the upright bracket to the already installed radiator bracket. I do think this side upright GPU area is best suited for larger GPUs, as this Waterblocked 4090 does look a bit odd. Alrighty guys, now that was a lot of information to process, and I just hope this helps you decide on whether this case is for you or not. There are some other things I do want to cover at the very end of this video, more towards if this case is directly for you, if it's not, if the original EVO is more suited for you, or maybe some other cases from LIAN that are coming out. But like always, let's jump in and check out the final build. So that's the final build there. I will talk a little bit more about this later on because I did manage to jam a heap in this EVO XL. Now some more things I do want to cover and get out of the way first before we wrap this review up, because it is going to be quite long overall, and I do apologize if some of you did get bored, but I do like to cover all of the features in these cases, especially all the water cooling, and with this new model supporting 420, I wanted to cover that, and also the 360, which I did earlier in this review. Now, the removing of the GPUs and installing them has completely been fixed. LIAN completely halted the launch for this. It was nearly a month because they tested more GPUs for their samples, and they did find that they had issues as well. I think they tried about a pool size of 20 GPUs instead of just a few, because I think I was the only one who fed this back, because it was only about 5 days till this case was coming out. And I was like, hey guys, once I get my GPUs in, they are super, super hard to pull out. I literally, as you saw, had to hit them out with the hammer and the screwdriver at the back, but that has all been rectified. The two changes that were made, these little knobs that go for where your GPU goes over and locks in where the holes and where a screw normally goes through the GPU, they've been made a little bit smaller, and also where the back of the GPU, where it lines up with those holes on the back of the motherboard tray, they've been made a little bit bigger to allow for different size GPUs. So that's all been done, and I believe that all mass production of the EVO XL has the updated motherboard tray, and I've tested this as well. They did send me the black tray and the white tray, and it is all good to go. Now, some other things I do want to cover. I want to cover around the back. Some more things about radiator support. I didn't cover res support, and one thing I did pick up was when using 420mm rads, probably even if you're going to use 280, because they are much wider than a 360, when you're installing them on the brackets at the top and the bottom, and also on the back of the bracket for the side radiator bracket, if you're using radiators that have, say, 6 ports or 4 ports where they have 2 on each side, so have 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom, if you are using very bulky stop fittings, obviously for this Overclockers, the UT60s, they have ports on the top and ports on the bottom. So obviously I'm going to want to put 2 stop fittings or stop plugs in the bottom of the radiator. Now, they do fail on the bracket, but it's not too bad. If you put thin ones in, yes, the bracket does slightly bend when you screw it in, but that isn't very uncommon. I've seen a lot of other cases do that when you have radiators that have dual ports on each side. They don't always fit flush in brackets, so just be wary with that. You don't have humongous thick stop fittings, as it might be hard to secure down. But as you can see, the ones I used were quite thin, and it just bends the bracket a little bit, so no biggie at all. Around the back, I didn't really need to use the cable brackets, those ones that you just clip on and then slide to the left. I think I used one that was literally to prop up that pass-through that has this hard tube that goes into the back for the soft tube. I didn't really need that. I ended up using the hard drive cages. I decided to keep the hard drive cages in, but I took out the sleds that holds the hard drives in. So I just had two big empty square holes that I could fill up with excess cables, because I did have rather long extension cables for all the PSU replacement cables were quite long. So I just managed to jam them up the top, and then any other cables for like the IO and things like that, I just put in the bottom one. So no issues there at all. Things like res support, I didn't really cover at all. The side spot, I want to cover a little bit more detail about. Can you fit things like D5s or DDCs in the back, where you can actually fit both? If you're going with something like an EK FLT, one of their flat reservoirs, if you have the side bracket in its middle position or in its front position, so that's the one that gives you the room in the rear, you can fit a DDC easily. You can put a pump cover on, no worries. You can fit an FLT with a D5, but it is very, very tight. Once you close that side panel, it is literally pushing up against the cables from the D5, so probably you won't be able to fit a pump cover, but if it's in the rear, I would say you probably don't need a pump cover to go on the pump as well, because it's out of sight. And then basically you'll be able to fit a 360 FLT res combo, no issues at all in the side. I don't think I've seen any brands do anything higher than a 360, but I tested a 360 and there were no issues at all. Now the rear fan spot I didn't really cover. It's a little bit tricky because in this position now with the motherboard tray centered, so you still got that 35mm space at the top, 35mm space at the bottom, you can fit a standard 120. You can nearly fit 240, but you can't. And mind you, this is only 120 support, not 140. So you can only fit up to a 240, only if you drop the motherboard in its lowest position. So you move this 35mm spacer from the bottom up to the top, drop the motherboard down, you can fit a 240, probably do a radiator. I wouldn't really think it would be necessary to fit a radiator up here because you're going to foul the top, so it's not really going to be that good and it's not going to look that pretty. But definitely things like fans, I tested with 2 fans you can fit, and also something that might come in handy is like a 240 FLT. Of course, you're not going to be able to fit the pump behind. You're going to need to use res brackets that come with those FLTs to bulk it out a bit so the pump can go behind. But something like the Overclockers pump res combo, the new Core series ones, they have the pumps on the front, so that can be flush mounted to the back, and then it just the pump sticks out in the front, and that is a 240 and that'll fit in that spot as well. Or you can go with a 120 as well. So something like my build, I'll talk a little bit about why I went with the 120 pump res combo. I could have put that up here and tried to clean it out of the way, but I think if it was in the back here, it might have been a little bit too much and a little bit too busy in this area. So that's why I went with it out in the front area over there. Something else I noticed was there's a universal pump mount. It's in a weird spot. It's way out the back. I'll throw some shots of B-roll. It's under each of the hard drive cages. So there's one at the very bottom and obviously one at the very top above the hard drive cage at the top, because obviously when you invert the case, the top now becomes the bottom. So that is also a universal pump mount there, and that's just for standard pumps. I would say that's probably not for reservoir support like a pump res combo, because it's only very short in height. It's only 168mm to that pump mount to where the PSU is in the middle. That's the bottom of the PSU, which is a shame. And that's another thing I want to mention, is not being able to remove the PSU and remove it into the top or into the very lowest position. Because if you could move it into the top, that would give you an extra whole PSU with the space for a pump res combo. And that would have been ideal for a build like this. I could have completely removed the pump res combo altogether, although I do think this does look pretty sick. I did mod this quite a bit. I completely themed it to white, so I did show that off. But if you didn't want to do that, you could completely hide a decent pump res combo behind. But being only the 168 millimeters, you're going to need a really, really small one to get it in there, because on the original Evo, the PSU could go in the 2 spots, the top or the bottom, but this one, it is fixed in the very center. Like, if you're capable of doing some modding, there's no reason why you can't drill some PSU holes and mount it in the top. You are gonna have to cut out a panel for obviously your cable to go through, because there's no holes, but there's definitely room for it. It's just not supported in this case unless you do a bit of serious modding. So that's basically the other features I missed out. I want to talk about the build I did, some of the paths I went down. So obviously earlier in the review, I talked about these white radiators. Now Overclockers only does white 420s that are in their UT60s, which are these 60 millimeters thick. So I tried very, very hard to get these all to fit, and I did. So the only way, as I mentioned earlier, the issue with getting the stop fittings to fit on the side radiator at the top and at the bottom was there are a set of fans behind this fan and rad combo there. So it's got 3 fans, it's got the radiator, and then it's got another 3 fans. The only reason how that worked is those fans push the radiator just a little bit further forward, and it does clear the frame of the case at the top and the bottom. So then the stop fittings will fit in, and then I can do the radiator and then the fans, and then the top I got away with the, this is the Apex, Z798 ROG Apex. It just fits. As you can see, these cables, they don't foul. It's just a little bit tight. It is kind of sitting on those, but it does completely install and it fits fine. But for you guys wanting to replicate this build, if you do want to go down with the white build, it's going to be very, very hard unless you're using this motherboard. Like, I tried 2 boards, and basically I got lucky with this one and the Z790 Extreme. I think I was using the X670E Extreme, very similar boards. They didn't fit. So it's going to be tough. It's going to be a hit and miss on which board you have. It's hard to say because the Apex has the VRM cooling a little bit lower. That's going to be your main problem. I guess you could use the Apex as like a reference and check the board that you want to use if you want to use 60mm radiator at the top without adjusting the motherboard tray any lower. But in saying that, if you do adjust this down lower, as I said earlier in the review, you can't even fit something like a 45mm thick 420 because that is going to foul on the motherboard. So by dropping this down to allow the 60, you can really only go something like a 30mm at the bottom. So you probably wouldn't. So the best thing you're gonna have to do if you want white rads without a 60 is you're gonna have to go with a different brand. And then if you go with a different brand, you're gonna have issues with mismatching colored whites and so on and things like that. So that's why I really wanted to try and push to get these 3 all white Overclockers radiators in this system. Now I decided to go with a single 120. You might be thinking, yes, it looks a little bit small, it's a bit out of place. The reason for that is the side is a 420 radiator, so you've got 3 140mm fans to fit. The only pump res combo, I wanted to go all Overclockers, obviously, for this build. They have the new Core series and they have their new 360 and 240, and those distros come in left and right. Basically, the pump is either on the left or the pump is on the right. So to use one of those, I would have had to try to center a 240 sized res on a 420mm spot. So that would have needed brackets to go to adjust it height-wise and brackets to adjust it in the center, and it would have looked a little bit messy. So I got away with this one here, which is just the 120. I managed to fabricate a bit of a custom bracket because I did use the Overclockers. They're the 140 to 120 brackets, and then I just used 2 screw holes at the back to center it, and it actually worked pretty good. And then I also added some mirror acrylic behind that reservoir, which I do in a lot of my builds, and it really makes that coolant pop. And a few other things I did. I'll throw up a stock image on what this pump res combo looks like. It does come in a standard DDC version, but this is their version of the D5. I know Overclockers have their own version of the D5 pump. It's not exactly a D5 pump, but it's pretty good because the whole housing is made out of some sort of metal. I'm not sure exactly what metal, but it's not like that standard plastic like a standard DDC. So I just painted the whole thing. I painted the collar, I painted the pump, I re-sleeved it, I added the logo, I repainted this bracket silver, and it just tied it in nicely to theme with the rest of the build. And probably that whole pump res combo was the hardest thing in this build because everything else is completely stock. And I didn't want to do too much custom work, especially in these case reviews, because I know you guys do like to replicate these builds, and you want to see what you can do without doing a heap of work. So I try to keep it very stock. The only other thing I did do is paint the stock backplate on the back of this Overclockers. This is a 4090 block, because that does come black, because you can imagine this whole white build having this black backplate would have just looked like a bit of an eyesore. So I did paint that white as well. Some other things I used was the new Overclockers Core 1 CPU block. I absolutely love these. I use this in a recent build, I think the last video, in a case review and a build, and the RGB is just on point, and I think Overclockers have really nailed it. I really like RGB that is very thin and narrow. It doesn't get overexposed. It looks really good, and it's nice and saturated, and you don't need to edit any of it in post. It just looks really nice and natural on film. And then of course it ties in nicely with that brand new G-Skill that is their Trident Z, but it is their white edition. Yes, they do have white memory finally coming out. I guess it is hard in this build because there's a lot of silver and whites, like this DIMM.2 module with the 2 SSDs, that is silver. This is silver. The VRM heatsink is all silver. There's a bit of white on the I/O cover, and then the RAM is white. So it's kind of hard to differentiate between white and silver sometimes. Some other things I use is the cable mod 180 degree adapter. Some people say don't use them or whatever. I've used them in quite a few builds. I've had no issues yet, and I think they just really do complement these builds, and it just cleans it up really nice. Because if you had this cable sticking around, it would either, probably I would say, would have to go over this bend, and with that adapter on there, it just looks really good. Then I said the motherboard was a Z790 Apex, 4090 Strix GPU, and then of course we have the LIAN Uni fans, which are the Infinity. They do have them in the 140s, which I'm really glad. They don't do too many fans in the 140s, so of course I went with these. They're a bit of a nightmare to film because they're all sort of mirrors on the side, and when you're bouncing off different areas in your room, you don't want to get random objects and stuff in these mirrors, because I like to keep it nice and clean. And then of course the CPU is a 13900K. All right, this is going on for a bit. I want to wrap this up. Now, you're probably asking, well, who would the EVO XL be for? Now, if you're a crazy water cooling enthusiast, if you're looking for a new case, being a crazy water cooling enthusiast, or you already have the original EVO, so not the XL, the original EVO, if you're struggling with rad space, say you got a couple of 360s and you want more cooling, yes, this is probably going to be for you. I would say go for it if you're not too worried about budget. This is the case for you. If you currently have an EVO, the original one, not the XL, with an AIO, and you don't use the new features, like you don't care about the pillar, you don't care about the new upright GPU, or if you're looking for a new case to do an all-in-one cooled build, with an all-in-one cooler, obviously, you don't need 420 support because there's not many 420 AIOs out there. I think there's probably only 3 or 4, and you don't care about the upright brackets, you don't care about moving the motherboard. I don't really see any need to move the motherboard unless you're going with a custom loop. So if you're not going with a custom loop, I don't really see the need for that. And if you don't care about the pillar, probably there's no reason to upgrade to this case. And I'll talk about price in a little bit, because you might be very subjective once you find out how much this is and how much the original EVO is. Now, if you already have an EVO, you need a new case, but you do want to go with the new upright GPU. If you just love that, how it works now, if you saw the original EVO and you didn't like how it was a real mess, you had to install the GPU on that bracket, had to mount it up top, had to squeeze your fingers through, or you had to install the cable first, squeeze your fingers through. It was a real nightmare, but if you held off doing that, but you really liked it and you love the pillar look, and if budget's not an issue, for sure, this case could definitely be for you. But in saying that, I can't tell you what you can and can't buy. Like, anyone can get this case, but these are just my thoughts in saying why you could or could not get this case. I would think if you're not doing a custom water cooled build, you're just doing 360 all-in-one cooler, 120mm fans, don't really care about the new features, then probably this case is not really for you. LIAN probably aren't gonna like me saying that, but I have to be honest with my thoughts. This is an extreme water cooling case, but then again, you might just wanna deck it out with a bunch of fans and leave it at that, and you might always like to upgrade to the latest cases out there, which is fair enough. But in saying that, I really feel like LIAN now need to bring out the original EVO, not the XL, because this is a little bit bigger, it's quite heavier, and a lot of you guys aren't going to be needing these features. So the original EVO, but with the new upright GPU, the removed pillar, maybe the removable motherboard tray, because hey, I would say not so much moving up and down if you're doing like a air-cooled build, but installing your hardware outside on the tray, then putting it back in. But I feel LIAN need to do all of that, but in the original EVO. And if you paid attention to our Computex coverage, LIAN had the EVO RGB, and I don't know much about that case, but if that is the original EVO size, but with the refreshed items that I just mentioned, not with the 420 support, because you don't really need that for most people's builds, I think that might be the case to look out for, providing it's not going to be more than this. I can't remember how much I said they were going to be in that video, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't going to be this price. This was by far the most when I did my Computex coverage. So if the original EVO or that new EVO RGB is only going to be like 30, 40 bucks more than the original EVO, that could be the case to go for if you're looking for something with those new features. Now, moving on to price, we have the black comes in at $234.99, so basically $235 US, and then white is $244.99, so that's $245 US dollars. So to put that in perspective, that is $90 more US for the XL than the original EVO. So that is quite a bit for some features that a lot of you probably won't use unless you're doing the custom water cooling, or you desperately want that new revamped upright GPU bracket, which does work. But in saying that, with the upright GPU bracket, you are going to need to go with the longer riser cable. It was I think it was 900 long. That's to get it all the way around the back and makes it a lot cleaner. So that was 100 bucks right there. The upright bracket is absolutely nothing to purchase. I think it was $6.99. If you do happen to have a long cable from your EVO, yes, it could be a worthy upgrade. So keep a note on that. So yeah, $90 more for the XL. It's going to be a decision for you. Like, that's a decent pack of RGB fans. I'm not even sure how much fans cost these days, but $100 for fans sounds about right. Now for pre-orders, they are basically going to be available today. I think this is September the 7th for this. So yeah, I'll throw the links up in the description for you guys. Newegg, all the main places. I'll find which one's Australia, probably PCCG gear. I'll throw them all up for you guys. But anyway, you've probably fallen asleep. This has been a very, very long video. I hope you guys do appreciate it, because this is probably one of my longest, in-depth, largest reviews I've done. I think there were 500 shots of B-roll just to cover all the parts of this case, and that is a lot to complete and smash out in the time frame. But luckily, or for me, the case was delayed a little bit. I did find that bit of a glitch. Unfortunately for you guys, you had to wait that little bit longer. But for me, it means I could sort of fine tune this review a little bit more to make sure I covered absolutely everything for you guys to help your decision on purchasing this case. So I want to do a shout out to LIAN, of course, for sponsoring this build and this video to get this review to you guys, and then Overclockers for the great support for all of the water cooling, and then also Mods who helped me out with all the shipment for that Overclockers gear for this build as well. But anyway, that's it. I want to thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next one.